Have you ever noticed how life has a habit of kicking you when you're down? And have you noticed that you seem to experience more emotional pain and suffering when you can least handle it, when you're most stressed out and anxious? If you have, then the good news is that nobody is sticking pins in a voodoo doll that looks just like you, and the world isn't conspiring against you. But there is something that your brain is doing that is bringing on more emotional pain and suffering, a disproportionate amount of pain and suffering that you don't need to be doing when you know why it's happening. So essentially, this is what happens. Your brain is designed to make things familiar, and it's designed to default to familiar things when pressure strikes, when stress rises. Psychologists would say that we revert back to old patterns of pre-programmed behavior when we are stressed out, when the cognitive load has become too much. And we do that because your brain is an amazing organ that likes to preserve and conserve energy. And it takes a lot of energy to think differently. It takes a lot of energy to think yourself out of stress. But it doesn't take much energy to drop yourself back into familiar patterns because they've already grooved themselves into your neurological hardware. Yeah? So that's what happens. And the question then is, well, why is pain and suffering more familiar than not pain and suffering? And the answer to that is this. We have a 5-to-1 negative bias inside our brain, which means we're 5 times more likely to default to the negative things in life than the positive things in life, and we're 5 times more likely to recall and remember those things. We also lay down negative emotions and negative memories into our long-term memory more often than positive emotions, and our brain does that because it wants to keep us safe. So it wants us to remember the things that cause us pain, suffering and harm, and it does that by dropping them into long-term memory. Again, that makes these things more familiar. So when we get stressed out, when we get anxious, our brain defaults to this pattern. It defaults to what's familiar. And the most familiar thing in your life is probably pain and suffering emotionally and mentally. So if you want to change the pattern, you need to make the thing that is most familiar not pain and suffering. You need to start looking at things that are more positive. You need to start doing things like that gratitude thing that people talk about. You need to do things like heart meditations. You need to do things like cardiac coherence that I talk about a lot, where you program positive emotions, acceptance, compassion, love, etc. into your heart. Sounds woo-woo, it's not woo-woo, hardcore fucking science. But anyway, that's why it happens. Why do you default back to negative patterns of behavior when you're stressed out? Why does life kick you when you're down? Because that is familiar. We need to stop making it familiar.